Hi, everybody. Welcome to the program today. My name is Paul Bemis. I'm your host, and we're going to be having a session today on HVAC systems in COVID-19 times. This is a topic we have visited a couple of times on this program, and one that is absolutely germane to everything we are doing, I think, today. And to get that going, I'm going to be introducing my colleague, Mike. Before I get started, however, it's a couple of things just in terms of housekeeping. For those of you who haven't done this before, you will notice this is a GoToWebinar session, and there is a little panel over there on your right that allows you to ask questions. The way we do this is we have you write the questions out and send them in on text through that little mechanism, and then I will present them to Mike at the right time. So the point there is that if you want to ask a question, feel free to do it. Do it as we go, I think is the best way to do it. And I will ask Mike the question and try to get you an answer as best we can. So feel free to go ahead and do that. One other point, there will be a survey at the end of the session. We'd like you to fill out, please. Part of the ASHRAE best practices is for us to get feedback about these presentations. So please fill out the survey at the end if you're able and have time to do it. So with that, I'd like to introduce Mike. Mike Macamel is a senior contributor at the Mitsubishi Electric Train Corporation. He is from Ohio, and he's an Ohio State Buckeye, and probably cheers for that football team, as I do quite regularly, because they're a lot of fun. He is a registered PE in the state of Ohio, also a certified energy manager, a lead green associate. He's been in the business over 30 years. Including 8 years with Mitsubishi and 19 years with Train. So Mike, I'd like to welcome you to the program today and let you take it away.
Sounds good. Thank you, Paul. Hopefully everybody can hear me just fine. Before we get started, when we were putting this presentation together, Paul had sent me some of your previous broadcasts, and I have to say I was quite impressed with your June broadcast with Dr. Stephanie Taylor and Dennis Knight. And then a recent one that was done by Paul Biersdorf of Limbaugh Mechanical. I was really impressed that he did that the day before he retired. So I think I'll be giving a presentation, an ASHRAE presentation, the day before I retire.
Well, we haven't heard from him since, Mike. We don't know where he went, but I think he's sleeping. He's tired. He's been sleeping ever since, I think.
Yeah, we got a lot to cover. I'm going to jump right into it. Now, I'm not going to go into every topic because a lot of it's already been covered. But we'll hit a little bit upon each of the major topics as far as remedies for treating contagious pathogens. So just a quick agenda. We want to understand the basics of contagious pathogens like viruses and bacteria, understand how the building HVAC system can impact the spread, and then understand the relative effectiveness of some of the different technologies and measures that we'll look at. Our corporate attorney asked me to put this slide up there, so I have to oblige her. I just really want to point out that middle bullet item. We're actually going to talk about some specific technologies and actually use company names and things like that. We do talk about some of the claims that they make. So just bear in mind that those are third-party claims. We're not necessarily making those claims. We're just passing them on, the claims that the companies themselves are making. So we've not analyzed all these claims ourselves. So I always like I like it when people put a little bit of a personal touch. So I added this screen. The picture on the left is my wife and one of her fellow nurses. My wife is Louise, is the one on the left. And early in this year, I want to say maybe around mid-March, she got redeployed as a registered nurse as a coronavirus swabbing nurse. So that's her standing there in a beautiful spring day in Ohio, getting ready to do swabbing on people that are getting tested for coronavirus. And then statistic, I'm guessing a lot of people saw this, but just recently, I think it was November 30th, they came out and said that COVID was here in the US as early as December. They tested a bunch of Red Cross blood. I think they did 7,389 samples and found 106 positives. So if you assume that was a random sample and you multiply that out by roughly 350 million people in America, that means there was up to 5 million people that had this disease back in December. Of course, when you figure the incubation time, it was probably even earlier than that. So just something I found interesting. We've all seen little videos like this, but just want to recap what the major vectors for disease spread are. You've got projectiles, so coughing, sneezing, loud talking, singing, fomites, which are larger particles that settle out on surfaces. And then the most problematic of all is the airborne portion, which we can see going towards the top of the screen. Seems like we've got a pretty good handle on fomites with all the cleaning that we're doing and hand washing. And masks certainly help the projectile, but the airborne one is the one we're still struggling with, still dealing with, still addressing. The CDC and NIOSH have come out with a kind of a definition of what constitutes a droplet versus an aerosol. So they make the cutoff at about 10 microns. So you can see anything larger than 10 microns basically settles out to a surface in a matter of seconds or a matter of minutes. Whereas if it's smaller than 10 microns, it tends to stay suspended for a matter of hours or sometimes even days if it's small enough aerosol. So one of the things that makes this virus so challenging is how small it is. So this is just a kind of a wheel here of sizes of different pathogens. As we rotate clockwise, we get smaller, but you can see that SARS-CoV-2 is about 1/8 of a micron in diameter. So it's somewhere between the size of an HIV particle and a tuberculosis particle. So very, very small in size, which means obviously it's going to be harder to catch in filters and things like that. I did want to go over the ASHRAE position document. I'm not going to go over the whole document on infectious aerosols, but rather just their grading scale, because at the end of the document, they basically say, here's our grade for different measures that you can put in place. Of course, A is the best grade. They strongly recommend. B is actually a good grade. They do recommend doing it. C is we can't decide whether it's the balance or the benefits or harms wins out. D, we recommend against, and E is there's just not enough evidence. So even though they were pretty late to the party, I think Paul said that you guys knew it was airborne, back in early to midsummer or even earlier. Well, the CDC just, finally October 28th put out their statement saying that, yes, indeed, this is airborne. And when we cough, talk, sneeze, sing, do that sort of stuff, we produce respiratory droplets. So that's what we're going to focus on from here on out. If you look at ASHRAE's IAQ related recommendations, I borrowed this screen from Train did a webinar yesterday. I don't know if anybody saw it on their partnership with a company called Synexus, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. But basically, they fall in 4 categories: dilute, exhaust, contain, and clean. So we'll talk about each of those. One thing I always like to point out, and it's just maybe a pet peeve of mine, is that people interchangeably use the term COVID-19 when talking about the virus and SARS-CoV-2. The virus is SARS coronavirus 2. It's the second variation of this. The first one was, I believe, in 2003, 2004. And then the disease that it causes is COVID-19. And of course, it can be asymptomatic, where you don't even know you have it, pre-symptomatic, where you haven't yet developed symptoms, or symptomatic. So any of those 3 categories. So we'll talk about fresh air, ventilation, and dilution first. Just a few highlights here. I would like to point out, fresh air ventilation is to control for, a lot of the things shown there: particle pollution, odors and gases. CO2 is a big one. A lot of buildings have demand control ventilation where they measure CO2 in the space and then open outside air dampers as CO2 builds up. CO2 is a pretty misunderstood molecule. I think most people think that it's harmful at relatively low levels, like 1,000 parts per million. Of course, ambient concentration is about 400 parts per million. And then most buildings will start opening their fresh air systems at about 800 to 1,000. Well, it's really not harmful at all to human beings. CO2, in nuclear submarines, they allow it to get up to, I think it's around 8,000 parts per million. And those people are submerged for 60 days at a time with no ill effects on human health. What CO2 is good for, it's a good proxy for how many human beings are in the space. And it's actually the other things that our bodies put off, things like ammonia and methane. and even small amounts of things like acetone and ethanol and even carbon monoxide, believe it or not. We put off trace amounts of carbon monoxide. So it's those other things that we put off as we breathe and perspire that make the space unpleasant. It's really not the CO2 that's the problem. As far as fresh air ventilation, we always want to look at air changes. I think Paul Bemis made a good point last time, or somebody did on one of the previous broadcasts, that it's easy to make the mistake of looking at your total supply air and calculating your air changes. And that's a mistake you don't want to make. Really, you should only be looking at the fraction of the supply air that is outside air in determining how many air changes you're getting in a building. Also want to talk a little bit about the ASHRAE ECIP epidemic conditions in place, and then the post-epidemic conditions in place with regard to increasing ventilation. So that seems to be a big theme. With ASHRAE, ventilation and filtration are probably the two biggest themes. There's option one, where you can increase your outside air based on cooling coil. You can look at the discharge air temperature. If basically all of your cooling control valves are not fully open and your discharge air is satisfied, you start slowly opening your outside air damper and closing your return air damper. And you do that 3% every 15 minutes. And then if you're not keeping up with your discharge air, you basically reverse that cycle, except you do it a lot quicker. So you close it 6% every 5 minutes. So I think that's about 6 times as fast closing it as opening it. And then you can do the same thing, except do it based on space conditions rather than discharge air conditions. So that's the ECIP and the post-ECIP. One thing I'd like to point out is that, I think everybody recognized early on, you can't just open your outside air dampers without some sort of ramification to your cooling capacity and heating capacity. Obviously, you're going to spend a lot more money heating and cooling and dehumidifying air as you increase outside air percentages. And then on those 95-degree days or those 0-degree days, you probably don't even have enough central plant capacity. If you have existing air handlers, and if you have the ability to put in a DX coil and a drain pan in an existing air handling unit, you can add condensing units, variable speed or VRF condensing units. Most manufacturers have what we call a LEV kit, or linear expansion valve kit. So essentially, you can match a VRF condensing unit with a third-party DX coil and get a VRF system in a built-up air handler or an existing air handling unit. So that may be one way to increase the capacity without taxing your central plant heating system and your central plant cooling system. So if you look at the grade, ASHRAE gives an overall grade for effectiveness of a B. And like I said, some people don't think a B is a good grade if you're used to getting all A's, but in the ASHRAE grading standard, a B is a good grade. Second topic, advanced filtration. We're not going to spend a ton of time on this. We want to filter out all kinds of things, whether it's dust and pollen or mold and soot, you name it, bacteria, viruses. As mentioned earlier, the coronavirus, SARS coronavirus 2, is about a 0.125 of a micron in diameter. So very small, even smaller than bacteria. Now, different viruses, there's a spectrum of sizes here for different viruses. They run from about, I think, 0.01 up to about 5 microns in diameter is typical. So you can see here we've got the PM 2.5. We'll talk later about that, size particles, and then PM 10. So this PM 2.5 is any particle less than 2.5 microns in diameter. And you can see what's respirable and then what's exhaled or discharged out of the lungs when we breathe. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about MERV. I know you guys have covered this extensively, but I did want to point out, if you look at VRF indoor units, most of the standard MERV filters, so pretty much all the indoor units come with a cleanable filter. You snap it out of the unit, put it in a mop sink, clean it up, let it dry, and snap it back in. There are a few styles of units where we can get up to MERV 13. You're really not going to get much past MERV 13 with any VRF system, and that has to do with the static pressure capability of the indoor units. Generally, even the what they call high static units of VRF units are only good for about 1 inch of external static pressure. Speaking of that, the two styles of units across most of the manufacturers that can do a higher filter, MERV filter up to say MERV 13, or the large cassettes, the what we call the 3x3, even though it's technically 33 inches by 33, and then the ducted units, both the vertical ducted, which is not shown, and the horizontal ducted. So if you're wanting to do MERV 13, you can still put a VRF system in. You're going to be somewhat limited on your styles of indoor units. So real quick, HEPA filter, a true HEPA filter has a definition as defined by the Department of Energy, 99.97% efficient down to 0.3 microns. Pretty expensive, MERV 17 through 20, and a very high pressure drop. Some people call MERV 13 through 16 HEPA type filters. So it's, there's really no agreed upon industry standard definition for that, but sometimes you'll see these called HEPA type filters. About a third as expensive and not nearly as efficient, but still pretty good and better than most of the filters that we're used to traditionally in HVAC systems. So particle retention, I know everybody's probably seen a slide like this. Mechanisms for particle removal include interception, impaction, diffusion, and then electrostatic attraction. And when I say electrostatic, that's not electrified medium, but rather like when your socks stick together, taking them out of the dryer. But diffusion relates to the particles that are generally about 0.1 microns and smaller. They follow a pattern of movement called Brownian movement, which means they just kind of bounce around randomly, which makes them much less predictable in terms of capture. So as I said before, HEPA filters, one of their hallmarks is a high air pressure drop. So it's usually over an inch, typically 1.2 inches, and that's clean. As they get dirty, the pressure drop goes up. So generally, we'll have a higher surface area. You can see here that we cut the face velocity in half by doubling the cross-sectional area of the filter bank to keep that pressure drop to something reasonable. But even with low face velocities, there's a high pressure drop. And then also that cost is an issue too. If we look at some of the MERV ratings and we look at a bigger pathogen like an influenza virus, which is up to almost 4.7 microns or 5 microns in diameter, they still perform pretty well. So MERV 13 would capture about 46%, and that's just in one pass. So we go up from there, MERV 15 HEPAs, and then I didn't know this, but there's something called a ULPA, ultra low particulate air filter, and it's 99.999% greater than 0.1 microns. I don't think these are used much in HVAC systems, probably because of cost and pressure drop both. So ASHRAE's recommendation for non-healthcare buildings from the position document is basically put in a MERV 13, or if the equipment can't handle a MERV 13, put in the highest level that you can get for that particular piece of equipment. So overall grade for effectiveness, true HEPA's A, so the highest grade, and then a portable HEPA unit, so one that just sits in the middle of the room with a fan and a HEPA filter, evidence level B. So once again, B is a good grade. So here's something I wanted to point out, the question to ponder. On the left, what I'm showing here is a built-up applied system, chillers, boilers, an air handling unit per floor, and then air handling units that serve multiple spaces. So this could also be a rooftop unit, a large rooftop unit. So if you're building a new building, and let's say budget's not a concern, and the thing that you really care about is having the healthiest building, what's going to be better? And I'm not saying I know the answer to this, I'm just posing the question. Putting in a system where you put in a real good filter like a HEPA filter, but you take air from 10 or 15 different spaces on a single air handler, you mix that air, and then you redeploy it out to all the spaces. So in other words, if you have one room where somebody's infected, you're pulling that air from the infected room back and redistributing it to all the other rooms served by that unit. Versus something like, say, a VRF system or other terminal unit system. So this would not be unique to VRF, it could be a fan coil or water source heat pump system where you have a dedicated outside air system. In this case, it's decoupled because it's sending the fresh air directly to the space. However, if you have an infected person in this middle room, it's pretty much the infection, the airborne infection is staying in that room, or at least the HVAC system is not mixing it and sending it to the other room. So just something to think about. Next class, we'll probably spend the most time here is talking about bipolar ionization. And then here's a mouthful, photohydroionization, which I'm just going to abbreviate PHI. So there's a lot of different types of bipolar ionization technology and filters out there. There's also monopolar ionization, which my understanding is not used much because it tends to produce a lot of ozone. But essentially with bipolar ionization systems, we're taking atoms and molecules and putting a charge on them. And when we put a charge on them, they tend to be attracted to other charged particles and stick together, or what's called agglomerate. We'll see on the next slide. And then we can, once we get those particles out into space, they tend to be sticky. So things like dust and other particles, even pathogens like viruses and bacteria, will stick to those ionized particles, and then we can bring them back and filter them or even kill them. So if you look at the basic principles, we're creating positive and negative poles. They agglomerate, which is a fancy word for stick together. And then once they stick together, they're easier to capture and or kill with something like, say, a UVC light, which if we have time, we'll talk a little bit about that too. These work really well. I had one in my house, and we used to have to dust once a week, and we went to where we didn't really even have to dust once a month. So I know they work well on cigarette smoke and dust and pollen and things of that nature. I can speak firsthand to that. As I mentioned earlier, ozone is always a consideration. Some versions of bipolar ionization create ozone. The good thing about ozone is that it's a disinfectant. The bad thing about ozone is that it's harmful to human health, even in very low concentrations. We do have a UL standard in the United States. UL 867 allows up to 50 parts per billion. Now, parts per billion, not million, so very low levels. There also is a self-reporting standard, UL 2998, that manufacturers can test and certify themselves as meeting, and that's less than 5 parts per billion ozone production. So really, if people bring up ozone as a reason not to use bipolar ionization, I think that's been pretty addressed pretty thoroughly by that industry. So once again, a little more detail of how it works. So we've got an oxygen molecule here. We're going to knock off one of the electrons, so that makes this oxygen molecule positive. That electron goes and combines with another oxygen, so now we've got a positively charged molecule which goes out and sticks to other molecules, and then we have a negatively charged molecule, once again sticking together with other molecules. Deploy those out into the space, and once in the space, they stick to all kinds of things, which we can then pull them back to the air handling unit, filter, and kill them. So just a couple of examples of systems where they actually use bipolar ionization, and then they charge the media. This is the one I had in my house a number of years ago. I've since sold that house, Dynamic Air Quality Solutions. And they would charge this media with basically a 24-volt charge, and everything coming back from the space and return air would really stick quite well to those filter media, which are sandwiched inside these mesh frames here. And then Carrier has a system called Infinity Air Purifier. It's a residential system, but just a couple of examples. I'm not going to talk much about this because Paul Beersdorf talked quite a bit about it in one of your previous broadcasts and his success with the product, the iWave. I think he talked about the new Calgon iWave F air purifier. And then I think this is the Mini. I call them both the dog collar. Looks like a dog collar to me. And then GPS also has a GPS FC3. I think these are all needlepoint bipolar ionization devices. So they all work off of the same concept. So GPS did do some testing. They did some specific testing specific to SARS-CoV-2 with Innovative Bioanalysis, a laboratory out in California. And they did it in conjunction with the airline industry. And they were showing a 99.4% reduction after 30 minutes I believe that was on a static surface though, so it really wouldn't maybe apply as closely to our industry because we're dealing with moving air. In this case, on a static surface, I believe it was a Petri dish, they were able to see that kind of reduction. So some pretty good success there. One of the things I wanted to point out though is sometimes it's easy, especially in the middle of a pandemic when there's a lot of fear and to lose sight of the forest through the trees. So that's why I put this little picture here, the forest and the trees. This is some research from Dr. J.M. Logue. And this on the vertical axis here is disability adjusted life years lost per 100,000 people. Okay, so this not only includes deaths, but this includes, if you're impacted, you develop emphysema, some sort of lung disease where you don't have any quality of life. This takes that into effect too. And you can see it's a logarithmic scale. So the first one here, PM 2.5, is 10 to the third. So that's 1,000 disability adjusted life years lost per 100,000 people. The next closest one is secondhand cigarette smoke, and it's about 100. So PM 2.5 is 10 times as nasty to our well-being as secondhand cigarette smoke, and we know that's bad. So I guess my point here is there's a lot of people that are still skeptical about bipolar ionization. I don't have a dog in the hunt or a horse in the race, but what I say is if it makes little things stick together and easier to remove those things, and we know that PM 2.5 and secondhand cigarette smoke are big contributors to poor human health outcomes. That alone right there is reason to at least consider the technology. So this is photohydroionization, PHI. That's the molecular makeup of hydrogen peroxide. So basically it creates an aerosolized, ionized hydrogen peroxide and deploys that out to the space at very low levels, about 10 parts per billion. It really, when you read the technology, it kind of looks like a combination of PCO, photocatalytic oxidation, which we haven't talked about yet, and bipolar ionization. The technology has been around a long time, and they make pretty general virus and bacteria and effectiveness claims. When I first saw this and started studying this, I didn't really give this much credence. After watching Train's broadcast yesterday, they formed a partnership with a company called Synexus. They convinced me that, hey, this is probably worth a second look. So Synexus, is a company developed in the last, 20 or 30 years. Basically, the hydrogen peroxide is like an immune system for your building. So our bodies, I didn't know this, but our bodies actually naturally produce low levels of hydrogen peroxide. I know my mom used to give it to me. If I had a canker sore in my mouth, I would swish with it and it would just make that thing go away very quickly. So they call it DHP, just like, we need another acronym. We don't have enough already. Instead of PHI, they call it DHP. And, they talk about the advantages, not only being things like bacteria and viruses, but transfer contamination, even pests and insects, and then odors like VOC or VOCs. So this was one of the screens that they showed. So the single Synexus unit would have to run continuously for 2.5 years to reach the concentration of one droplet of hydrogen peroxide, which I guess is somewhere between 150 and 750 parts per million. OSHA says the safe level is 1 parts per million, so that would be equivalent to 1,000 parts per billion. And they're looking at levels right around here. So I think that's 50 to 250 parts per billion. Overall grade for effectiveness, ASHRAE is really silent on bipolar ionization and dry hydrogen peroxide. They really don't come out and say much of anything, at least not in that document that I referenced. So moisture and humidity control, we'll probably spend the most time in this category. So those of you that were on the June broadcast recognize Dr. Stephanie Taylor. That was quite impressive that your group was able to have her as a speaker. This is her research. She was the one that was a pediatric oncologist, and a lot of her patients were getting sick and even dying from respiratory diseases. So she went back to school and got a master's in architecture and then also certification in infectious diseases. And basically she found this sweet spot between 40 and 60% RH, where everything goes to a minimum. So whether it's a bacteria, contamination, viruses, VOCs, all kinds of stuff essentially drops off close to zero at that sweet spot of humidity. Same thing with hospital-acquired infections. This is another slide that she showed that was a part of my original presentation. So hospital-acquired infections, once the RH gets above 40%, you can see right here in the middle, the HAIs go down to next to nothing. And so there's kind of an opposite shaped curve there. And then once it starts going back, in this case below 40%, hospital-acquired infections start rising. Hospitals care a lot more about these nowadays. In the old days, I don't want to say that the hospital didn't care, but if you had to stay a few days longer, that was just more revenue for them. But now my understanding is they don't get reimbursed by Medicare if you get a hospital-acquired infection. In other words, if they get you sick, they have to eat the cost of that. So if we look at humidification in winter, why is greater than 40% creating benefits? Well, we talked about it just keeps the respiratory system healthy. Your mucous membranes, your throat, your lungs, you don't become as dehydrated. You think about those times where you're in an airplane where the RH is extremely low and you forget to drink water, how dehydrated you are when you get off of a long flight. Or same thing if you go to Tucson, Arizona and forget to take a bottle of water with you everywhere, you get dehydrated quickly. But it also keeps the viruses larger. So the virus is very small, the SARS-CoV-2, an eighth of a micron. But if it's encased in a water droplet, it's effectively the size of the water droplet. So higher humidity keeps viruses larger, so they tend to fall out on surfaces as fomites. It also prevents them from being aerosolized down to their true size. So when it's really, really dry out, you've got just that very, very small particle to deal with. And then it increases adhesion to filters. So this is another screen capture from the NIOSH document, and they talk about water increases adhesion. You just think about it. Water or humidity makes everything a little more sticky, whether it's carpet, as shown here, or a filter, makes everything stickier. So things, those viruses and bacteria are just going to stick to those filters better because the media is somewhat, wet. And then the big question mark, the one that's being studied, and I think Dr. Taylor mentioned something about going to Stockholm and collecting a Nobel Prize, if you could figure this one out, is the impact on the virus itself. So they say that being surrounded by water actually has a protective benefit for the virus, that when it's totally dried out, it's actually more susceptible and will not, well, you can't say live as long because I think there's still some debate whether viruses are even living or not. And I know one of the speakers brought that up also last time. So what about, we talked about keeping it above or below, above 40%, but what about below 60%? So I've shown here a 2-position chill water valve and an on-off or cycling compressor. And these are very common in terminal unit systems. So the on-off compressor would be in PTAC units and water source heat pumps. 2-position chill water valve might be in a room fan coil unit or a blower coil. And then the one in the middle here showing a VRF system, which has got a modulating expansion valve and a variable speed compressor. So we'll see on the next screen what happens, that these systems are really very, the 2-position chill water valve and the cycling compressor, very poor at latent removal, especially on part load days. Whereas the VRF system, between ramping the compressor up and down in speed and metering the refrigerant with the expansion valve, and then controlling fan speed, doing those 3 things together, we can essentially assure that there's always a cold coil. So you'd never have real warm air coming off of that coil. You've always got a cold coil when you're in the cooling mode. With the other 2 system types, what we see is a lot of this. And what this is this essentially shows that as you go into cooling, it takes a while for the condensate to actually start falling into the pan. In other words, these drops start building up on the surface of the coil, and it takes 5 or 10 or 15 minutes to really build that up. So if you have a spring or fall rainy day, it's 65 degrees, it's raining, there's really virtually no sensible load, but you've got a really high latent load, your compressor is not going to run very much, or your 2-position chill water valve is not going to be open very much. So you might run 5 or 10 minutes out of an hour and then be off for 50 or 55 minutes. Well, essentially, you're just re-evaporating the moisture back into the air as soon as that compressor goes off or that chill water valve closes. That moisture essentially goes right back into the space. You're essentially doing no latent. And if you have a central plant where you're actually doing chill water reset, and instead of making 42-degree water, you're delivering 50-degree water, you've just made that problem that much worse. So there's a thing being talked about right now is what is the ideal dew point? The industry kind of gravitated around just assuming that 55 was the best leaving air dew point to design DOAS systems for. And I'm guessing that was because air handling units, 55 was kind of a typical supplier temperature. But there's a thing where they're looking at low dew point design now for commercial buildings and even institutional buildings. Now, this has always been common low dew point for things like hockey rinks where you need extremely dry air. They'll even drive it down lower than 45. But there's some research being done that this is a much better standard for most buildings. I'll show you why. Just want to point out a couple of resources if you want to do some further study. Trane has an engineer's newsletter. They've been putting this out since before I started with the company back in the late 80s. Volume 49-1, which was recently released, talks about the impact of DOAS supplier dew point temperature on space humidity. The second resource, also put together by Trane, is a systems catalog, a variable refrigerant flow systems catalog that was put out in March of this year. Really a well-written document. It essentially walks you through a decision wheel for selecting the components and the system type of a VRF system. Now, it does spend probably 2/3 to 3/4 of the manual on the VRF system, but it also spends about 1/3 of it talking about the DOAS system and why 45 dew point might make more sense. And if you boil it down, it's really because you're decoupling the latent and the sensible load. So you're essentially moving the latent load to the DOAS system, which is what it does best. And then you're moving the sensible load, which the terminal unit system is better at, or the VRF system is better at sensible, even though it's decent at latent. And decoupling those, you can actually run this system a lot more efficiently. Now, I don't have time to talk about how we can do that. That's a whole other separate presentation in and of itself. But we can also lower, possibly sometimes lower installed costs and definitely lower operating costs and give a much more comfortable building. Psychrometrically, and I know it's going on 8 o'clock, so I'm not gonna, that'd be cruel to hit you up with too many psychrometrics, but going instead of the saturation point at 55 going down to 45, you're removing almost 1/3 again as much water from your return air. So it's a significant amount. A little more detail in the psychrometric chart. If you look at taking your outside air through your DOAS down to 55 and then providing some reheat, there's going to be a lot of days, whether it's a June or July or August muggy summer day or a wet shoulder season day, where you're bringing that conditioned air in basically at higher than space humidity. So you're adding to the space humidity. You're not giving any dehumidification benefit to the air that's in the room. Yes, you're dehumidifying the outside air, but you're still adding a net load of humidity. Whereas if you take it all the way down to 45 and then apply some reheat, in this case 10 degrees, that's going to, once you follow your sensible heat ratio curve back up, put you at a much more better spot with regard to humidity. This is a schematic that I put together, but basically think of it as the outside air as a sponge. You can either deliver a somewhat wet sponge to the space, which is what you would have at 55 on those wet days, on those humid days, or with this optional lower dew point, you can deliver a dry sponge or a dry plug of air and actually have some of your latent load in the space be attracted into that plug of dry air. So they did some simulation in this VRF systems manual on the two, and if you look at 55, you'll see that there's actually, in most climates, other than maybe the arid climates, there's a lot of days in those shoulder seasons where you're 65, even up sometimes to close to 70% relative humidity in the space. Whereas if you go to 45, you're pretty much guaranteed of being 55 and lower as far as your relative humidity. If we look at, they also looked at building types, and this is from the Engineered Newsletter, and they ran simulations on all these different building types. Of course, you've got different densities of people in these different building types, but you can see that, you know, at 55 supply air dew point on those most humid of days, you know, you're really not able to keep the relative humidity below 60%. Like I said, you're going to be pushing 65, sometimes 70%. Now, if you've got things like auditoriums and conference rooms, even 45 isn't enough to get it down to below 60% on that worst case humidity day. But if you look at 45, if you're just looking at a rule of thumb and you don't want to have to do all these complicated calculations for every job, 45 is kind of a good one that cuts across all these different space types and keeps your building humidity where you need it. So where is this application the best fit? Really the the wetter parts of the country, the eastern half of the United States. You're in New Hampshire, so you've got a marine or coastal climate. Pacific Northwest, really anywhere that it gets humid. The more arid parts of the country, not as much so. So just to summarize, 40 to 60% on the RH and 70 to 75 on the temperature. And ASHRAE gives this an overall grade for effectiveness of a B. Once again, a good grade. So this is my second question to ponder. You know, for the last 8 to 10 months, I've heard ventilate, 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 ventilate. However, we've seen from Dr. Taylor's research that once we drop below 40%, these diseases like respiratory diseases and gastrointestinal diseases take off, and they really ramp up below 20% RH. So my question is, what's more important, keeping the RH above 40 or ventilating? Because most of your buildings, especially your commercial buildings in cold climates, do not have humidifiers. Or if you have a humidifier, it's probably not sized for lots of outside air. So if you start diluting in the winter and doing, running your outside air 24 hours a day and doing purge cycles, all that sort of stuff, and it's 10 degrees outside and there's essentially no moisture in the air, which of these two is winning out? Because they're really counterbalancing each other. So I don't know that there's been any study done on that, but I'm thinking, we get to about 0, sometimes 10, 15 below 0 on real cold days. I'm guessing you're similar in New Hampshire, maybe not quite as cold because you've got the influence of the Atlantic. But on those 0-degree days, I don't know that in my space I want it to be 10 or 15% RH. Personally, I think that's why people get sick on airplanes. So, I mean, I've not gotten very sick in my life, but the couple times I have, it's been right after an airline flight. And I think it has to do with the extremely low RH, even though they ventilate. I think they do about 30 air changes per hour on airlines. So we'll just do a little bit of UV and PCO kind of towards the end here. So UVC is basically does not make it through the ozone layer to the atmosphere. UVA rays, the higher wavelength, do make it through, and then UVB it partially makes it through and partially doesn't. We look at UV light treatments, they're all in the UVC light range, and they generally are around 254 nanometers seems to be the frequency that most of the systems are designed for. And if you look at their effectiveness, they're pretty effective on viruses. So this is saying it can take a virus from 100%, and this is a general curve, so it's like an average, down to 0% with a fairly low dose, less effective with bacteria, and then not very effective at all on spores, fungal and bacterial spores. So as I said, this is a screen capture from the ASHRAE Handbook 2019. It kind of shows this peak of effectiveness. So on the vertical axis is germicidal efficiency, and you can see that it peaks around 255, 260 nanometers in terms of wavelength. So the optimal wavelength for germicidal effect is 254 nanometers, and that's what most of the commercial products out there are designed around. UV effectiveness is essentially a function of dosage measured in microwatt seconds per square centimeter. So you can increase the microwatt dosage, or you can increase the length of time, or you can do both to increase your dosage. But you can see that some things are harder to kill, like anthrax takes a very high amount of microwatt seconds per square centimeter for a lethal dose, whereas E. coli and MRSA are easier to kill with UV light. So this was some testing that was done by Biomed Central, and essentially they show some pretty significant reductions in things like E. coli and MRSA. This is a logarithmic scale, so 10 to the 6th would be a 100,000-fold reduction. You can see in about 10 to 15 minutes some pretty significant reduction. Same thing with tuberculosis, log 6, 100,000 reduction for MTB1, and a little bit less for MTB10. And then viruses, same thing. So this was done at 254 nanometers and 21 microwatts per square centimeter. So I think UV has its place. It's definitely good for cleaning coils. There's no doubt about that. As far as putting UV devices on terminal unit systems, I'll show some pictures here in a few minutes if we get that far. Then we have photocatalytic oxidation, called PCO. And here we're not necessarily using the UV light to directly kill the virus. However, we're using the UV light to activate a photocatalyst. And in most cases, it's titanium dioxide. That creates hydroxyl radicals. So a hydroxyl radical is a very unstable molecule, and it's looking to achieve stability. So it robs from other pathogens to achieve its stability, and thus inactivating things like viruses and bacteria. And the byproduct is water and CO2. So it works on very small particles down to 0.001 microns. I think it's a little bit more expensive, so you don't see it used as often, but pretty effective. I think Trane has a system called the Trane TCS, Catalytic Air Cleaning System, which is a combination of UV light. So the UV light, I think, is serving double purpose. It's directly impacting the virus and bacteria, and then it's also activating the titanium dioxide photocatalyst, and then combine that with filtration. This was one I found interesting. Somebody pointed this out to me. This company called SterilRay claims that far UV, specifically 222 nanometers, has properties such that it can kill pathogens basically on the fly. The big challenge with UV has always been getting enough exposure time, because air is moving pretty quickly through the coils and the filters, so there's not a lot of capture time there. But they claim that they can kill pathogens on the fly in less than 0.2 of a second. So if this is accurate, I think that's certainly a technology that has some promise, and I'll be keeping my eye on. This was one Trane National Accounts pointed out to me, that they're seeing a lot of restaurants used for two reasons. So they take the standard return air grill and replace it with one of these UVGI return air grill systems. And essentially you wire 120 volt power to it. And one of the things they like is that customers can actually look up and see a little bit of a halo on the ceiling or the ceiling tile around the diffuser. And it's just a visual reminder that something's being done. So they claim pretty generic claims, 99.99%. I always laugh when I see up to, because 0 could be up to, inactivation of airborne viruses and bacteria. I think it's a fairly cost-effective product, and that's why some of the national account customers for Trane are in the restaurant industry are looking at that. So one last thing on UV, it is very caustic for things like rubber, plastic. So you got to be careful. And I think Paul Biersdorf talked about this, belts, rubber and shear isolators, plastic piping like condensate piping. If it's directly hit, UV rays are directly hitting it, it will degrade very quickly in a matter of months. So there is some, and I haven't done a lot of research into this, but there's some LED UV lights, and here they show like one that's on a tape that can be fed up through a wall-mounted indoor unit. So with our the small compact indoor units you see in VRF systems, you can look at this technology or the dog collar technology, the iWave technology. I guess I shouldn't call it that. And then here's one, the APCO X on like a vertical version of an indoor unit or even a home furnace. The overall grade for effectiveness, this gets ASHRAE's highest grade of A. So with that, I'm going to leave it on the acronym Olympics page right here. I've thrown a lot of them at you. I think there's about 20 acronyms there, and open it up for any questions or comments. It's about 10 till.
All right, thank you very much, Mike. It wouldn't be a complete ASHRAE meeting without a bunch of TLAs at the end, of course, because you have to know. When I first joined ASHRAE, I needed an encyclopedia to figure out what people were talking about, a translation system. But for those of you in our audience, if you'd like to ask questions now, please go ahead. Use the system over on the right to type in a question, and I will try to get it answered. But one of the questions I have for you has to do again with this duration. The duration on the UV lights is fairly long. So just out of curiosity, in most cases, Mike, are they assuming multiple passes and that's how they get it killed, or are they actually putting enough intensity into those, I think mostly on the return side, to basically kill it on the way by?
Yeah, Paul Biersdorf talked somewhat about this, how they'll mount the UV lights basically, parallel to the airstream to maximize the amount of time that the air is exposed to the light. Mm-hmm. So it's going to be a different mounting scenario versus if you're just doing a coil irradiation. Mm-hmm. You want to keep the coil clean, mm-hmm. or the coil and the drain pan clean. So I think it's you can do things like increase reflectivity by choice of materials that you use and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I guess there's no questions here from my audience. Is that true? We have up to about 20 people online, and I'm not seeing any questions unless you're having trouble typing them in. So I think we're in pretty good shape. I'd like to do a shout out to our friends at Fox Stand Restaurant there in Concord on Manchester Street at the Red Blazer. I think we've got at least a couple of guys there. So I think Josh is there. I think John Grout is there. So I'd like to say hi to them there. And for any of those of you who would like to participate, we're doing these as hybrid. So we do the broadcast as a webinar, but we also, if you would like to meet with us or meet with Josh, I hear, Mike, that he's buying beer over there. I'm not sure exactly, but I think beer's on him is what I heard. So that's good.
That's the rumor.
And for next month, I'd like to point out that we're going to be talking a little bit more about energy. In January, we're going to be doing a webinar with New Hampshire Clean Energy, and we're going to be talking about solar and how solar PV systems have been reducing overall energy costs. There is a little bit of a debate about this. Some claim there is cost shifting going on associated with photovoltaic arrays for home use behind the meter. This report that just came out concludes that is not true. It's actually reduced the overall cost of energy for us all, and it'll be very interesting to review that. Madeline Manow will be with us from Clean Energy New Hampshire reviewing this report. It is January. I don't know the exact date. I will put a notice out for you all and make sure that you're all aware of that. Mike's put up his email address here for those of you who may have a question later, but may not be able to think of it now or be able to use our system to type it in. Mike's available at this email address being displayed right now. And I'd like to thank you, Mike, for joining us tonight. Interesting presentation, full of great material. I appreciate your participation, and want to thank you again for being with us. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you, Paul. Some big shoes to follow, but I enjoyed it. I appreciate the opportunity. Everybody have a good evening. Stay safe.
Thanks, and good luck to the Ohio Buckeyes. Are they playing, or what's going on this year with their season?
The game Saturday against Michigan, got canceled. Michigan players, too many of them tested positive. So, we're not, the big one's not being played.
It's crazy times, crazy times. Well, thank you very much, and look forward to working with you in the future.
All right, take care. Thanks, Paul. Bye-bye.
All right, bye, everybody.